My name is Barry Gardner. I'm a Member of Parliament in the UK. I am a former Minister of Environment and for climate change in the UK. And it's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon to introduce our panel. I am a member of the Climate Parliament, which operates globally. And so I'm going to first of all ask the Secretary General of the Climate Parliament, Sergio Misana from Chile, to introduce the Climate Parliament and to introduce the concept that we've been working on in predominantly African countries, which is the Green Zone Finance Project.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. Great to have us here. Yes, I am not talking into a microphone. Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. Great to be here. I'm Sergio Misana. I'm from Chile. I'm the Secretary General of the Climate Parliament, which is an international network of legislators working to combat climate change and protect the living planet. The Climate Parliament is a network that has been working for more than 20 years on environmental and climate issues. A lot of our work focuses on capacity building of parliamentarians across the Global South on these issues. We also create parliamentary networks in the countries that we work. These networks has to be and also always are multi-partisan, including legislators from government and opposition, which guarantees a continuity of our work, and also gender diverse. Gender diversity is very important for us. We have been doing a lot of work in Africa in recent years, and 25% of parliamentarians in Africa are women. We made a calculation recently that 40% of the MPs that we have engaged in recent years are women in our work in Africa. Other than capacity building, when MPs decide to take action, we support them, and we also feed them ideas for work. One key theme on which we have been working in recent years is green grids, and basically the idea that to transition quickly away from fossil fuels, grids are an absolutely crucial infrastructure. Smart grids, grids that can operate at continental level, grids that can carry energy from deserts and offshore wind to the load centers and not displace agriculture. Some years ago, we started something called the Green Grids Initiative, a high-level network of governments to collaborate on grids, which was launched at the COP in Glasgow. Right now, we're focusing on green zones, and this is the theme of this conversation. We are starting a project in Africa called Parliamentarians for Climate Finance, which is again a capacity building project focused on attracting green investment to the participating countries in sub-Saharan Africa, with the idea of concentrating on green zones. And the idea of green zones is special areas where there's very good resources for renewable energy generation, where there are also good transmission links and other transport links like ports, highways, railroad, areas where green industry can be developed and where we could have engagement with communities and also work on risk. I will be happy to continue a conversation on this, Barry, but sure. I see you want to ask a question to other panelists.
Let me just present you with a problem, first of all. Net zero by 2050 means that 80% of the global energy must change in the next 25 years. A third of the global population have no access to electricity, and we know that sub-Saharan Africa is key in that transition. There's money, there's lots of money, and it's waiting there to find an investment proposition. what I think we need to understand is, first of all, you spoke about risks, so let's talk about the risks that exist. What are the barriers to that money finding an investable proposition, particularly in Africa? Maybe you could outline some of those, the risks that are perceived that are raising the cost of capital, the currency risks. Just talk us through those risks and then say how it is that something like the green zones might be able to overcome some of those risks. How is it that the green zones are going to help mitigate that risk profile?
Yes, thank you, Barry. Yeah, you were talking about the energy access gap, the fact that there is, that issue particularly relevant in Africa, and in many ways also there's a climate finance gap where the countries in the global south require funds like the funds that have been pledged for their energy transition. They understand the severity of the urgency of this. And on the other hand, countries in the global north, to simplify things a little bit, have enormous amounts that capital that they're ready to invest, but a lack of bankable projects where they can invest. So there's that fundamental disconnect. The funds are there, but the global north, to put it in simple terms, is not seeing enough bankable projects, enough projects that are worth investing in. And this bankability is affected by risk, as you were saying. Particularly renewable energy projects have the characteristic that they require a very large initial investment, and then they're easy to, they're cheap to maintain a long time, and they yield profits, very safe profits, but over a long period of time. So the cost of capital is essential, and that is determined by actual risk and also perceptions of risk.
Okay, well, look, let's just explore that a little bit further, because you say quite rightly that these projects have a high upfront capital cost. But having the high upfront capital cost means that if you're an investor and you've got an obligation to, get a return on your investment for your shareholders, you're going to need to see that actually this is going to be repaid back over time, and currency risk is a huge factor. Just can you talk us through those currency risks, because the bill payers ultimately are paying in a currency that you might have invested in dollars, and you're getting paid back in a local currency which is fluctuating and not able to provide the return on investment that you hoped. So how is that affecting the investability, and how would something like the green zones be able to mitigate those risks?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I'm being really mean, but that's my function here.
Absolutely, but also, yes, currency risk is a very important part of that perception that affects the cost of capital, as is political risk. I mean, if there's political instability in the country, if there's a regime change or a different government that might not be interested in the same priorities, and also you have other kinds of risks that can affect this policy, for instance, continuity of policy. One key mechanism for that is guarantees, but one of the reasons for going with this zonal approach is that the funds available for guarantees are limited. So going into zones and developing renewable energy, green industry, and even schemes for protecting nature in a zonal approach would allow you to avoid direct confrontation with vested interests. Instead of trying to change legislation, regulation, create easy permitting or transparent mechanisms like auctions across the whole nation, you do it in a zone, And that way is one of the ways in which financially you can manage the risk much better.
Okay, look, that's helpful because we're seeing that instead of having to change primary legislation, you can, by regulation, set this up. If you're getting seed capital from government or from ODA, then there is that blended finance going in there that is able to de-risk to a certain extent the investments as well. So I want to, before I come to Leah to talk about the implementation of the project, I want to bring our parliamentarian in here. Cedric, perhaps you'll introduce yourself, but if you can talk about the role of parliamentarians and the way in which the Climate Parliament corrals all parties, obviously working bipartisan in a parliament, to make sure that there is that cross-party support for what's happening, and how you engage with stakeholders in the community to facilitate this.
No, thank you very much, Barry, and good afternoon to everyone in the audience. And thank you for the opportunity. I want to start off, Barry, by saying that I'm now a parliamentarian for 25 years. And the first COP that I attended was in 2009. I just missed it. But since 2010, I've been attending regularly COP. I've been part of GLOBE. I'm now part of the Climate Parliament as well, with parliamentarians from across the world are participating in these important discussions. My responsibilities in Parliament include, as a presiding officer, overseeing oversight, overseeing also the committee work, and ensuring that we have stakeholder involvement, public participation in all the processes that we as legislators do. I want to indicate that the situation in South Africa, as far as the political environment is concerned, is as follows. We have recently emerged from a general election. And for the first time since democracy in 1994, the governing party at the time, the African National Congress, lost an absolute majority. So there were different options. Rule by minority government, try to put a coalition together, and also looking then at what the country, what is in the best interest of the country, what the country needs, became important. And to cut to the chase and to cut a long story short, the biggest party, the president of the country is also the leader of the ANC, then decided, let's put together a government of national unity, consisting of 9 political parties in parliament. Now this is important because it comes to how do you manage and create that stability and the crossbench, inter-party discussions that must take place. Now that ultimately for me is the litmus test for your climate change approaches, your legislation and your NDCs. What happens when the governing party loses a majority? Will the incoming coalition or government of national unity change track, or will they stick to what is in the best interest of the country? Before the general election, South Africa processed and passed a climate change bill, and the president signed it into law in March this year. That's a critical piece of legislation because unlike some of the other examples that I've heard here in discussions with parliamentarians, yesterday also in another pavilion, is the strong contestation that there seems to be between political parties in parliament and groups outside parliament on why we need a green revolution, why we need to move away to green energy. And in South Africa, we're fortunate that we do not have that debate. There is coherence. There's a common approach across all the political parties. The climate change bill was passed with all parties in agreement to it. And there was an extensive consultation process involved. So any strategy that is being rolled out, we know, comes through a thorough public participation and sector engagement process. The president in 2020, in the aftermath of the the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, established, for instance, a presidential climate commission. The climate commission is inclusive, it is independent, and it advises government on the road towards a just transition, to a low carbon and a climate resilient economy. So members of parliament are also actively engaged, not only in parliament, but in their constituencies. We arrange different forums and set the scene for members of the public, labor unions, private industries, youth, women, to participate in our policy formulation and lawmaking processes. That is to ensure, and sometimes people say, but you take very long to pass a law. But from experience we have seen, it is better to be inclusive in your lawmaking process than to ignore or to sideline very important communities, private industries, and other sectors of civil society. When we get to eventually the green special economic zone, and I can give you the background to it, but there is one element after everything was done between a local government, City of Cape Town, they had a strategy for the Atlantis area. That is an opposition party. The province, they had a green strategy, also opposition party. They went to the national government, which was led by the majority party, and because they could sit around the table, they took decisions that was in the best interest of the people in that region, the best interest of the country, but also in the best interest of our commitments to the NDCs.
Look, I think that's a terrific example of how cross-party working and at different levels of government and administration can actually move something like this forward. And I think it's one of the features of the Climate Parliament that, Sergio, you always engage with climate champions in countries from all parties, not just from the governing party. And I think that's really important to build that consensus. I want to just press you a little, Cedric, on what are the, for the green zone that you've set up, the Atlantis project, what are the key sectors that are now going to be able to operate from that zone, and where is the finance coming from? So are we talking steel? Are we talking hydrogen, green hydrogen? What are we talking here?
Well, the Atlantis Special Economic Zone is quite unique. And just to give you some background to the zone, it's in an impoverished area. It's an area where there's high unemployment, alcohol abuse, abuse of women and children, because of lack of economic activities. So once the decision was taken, in consultation with the local community there, everybody was for it and say, let's go for it. But the emphasis is on green investments, green technology, working with UNIDO, for instance, a partnership that was established to create this green zone from taking off. But we need to be realistic. A lot of infrastructure development had to take place. And in the design and implementation of the infrastructure that is required, it complies with the latest green technology. Also, the workers who work there were educated through different labor forums on what is expected from them, so that they knew they were going to deliver a groundbreaking project for the country. So all the investments that are coming in, and it's relatively a small area that was started off with, about 118 to 125 hectares. It's growing now. Why? Because the investments are now flowing. The money, it's a partnership that we have with the private sector. It's also a partnership that we have with international financial institutions. Because ultimately, the private sector asks, but what benefit is there for us? The benefit is there's policy certainty. There's political stability. We have the rule of law. We have transparency in reporting. We have some of the best financial institutions in the country, but from the rest of the world that is also in South Africa. And those are critical elements to ensure that you start off on a sound footing. But ultimately, you must produce something. And that is where you must use your green energy. And once those products are produced, and it's a quality product that can be competitive for the export market, mostly because that's where your investor money is coming from, you create a sustainable economic environment because somebody wants to buy your product. But it also complies to our commitments under the Paris Agreement.
That's great. Look, men talk, women deliver, right? So, well, it's true, isn't it? It really is. And my apologies, there was going to be another woman on the panel today. Unfortunately, she's fallen ill. Heather Buchanan from B4NZ, Bankers for Net Zero, was going to join us to talk more about capital allocation and risk profile. But we have, in the form of Leah, the person who's actually delivering the Green Zones project with, what is it, 35 different countries we're talking to about this at the moment. I'll just talk about it. You tell us what you actually do. Leah.
Yes, so hello everyone, I'm Leah, I'm program manager for the Climate Parliament, and so we will be launching this project called Parliamentarians for Climate Finance, which we will deliver over the next 2 years in 15 sub-Saharan African countries for the moment. I'm not going to give you the list, but Uganda is part of it, Ivory Coast part of it, and Nigeria is part of it as well. And we will be looking at expanding the project to other regions. And so we are funded to really put parliamentary muscles behind the idea of the concept of green zones, really working with parliamentarians to make them champions, climate finance champion in attracting climate finance to their countries. And so in concrete terms, what we are going to do is organize green zones investment dialogues, both at international and national level. So we're really going to work at national level with the 15 countries, and then once a year around COPs, put them all together to have a green investment dialogue. So the idea of the dialogue is really to use the convening powers power of parliamentarians to bring together the MPs, but also public and private investors, guarantors, governments, etc., energy regulators, operators, to come together and really understand the idea of green zones and make sure that we create bankable projects in each country. So that is one thing, really convening the stakeholders all together. And we are going to develop a parliamentary toolkit, Green Zones parliamentary toolkit, that could include model legislations for green zones, but also concept notes. So once a green zone is identified, create a concept note for submission to development agencies such as the GCF, who's currently funding us. That's the second and I would say most important thing. And we're going to create these climate parliament groups in each country, which are going to be multi-partisan to ensure that even after an election, when the legislature change, we can have a sustainable engagement in the countries.
Leah, you talked about minimizing that political risk and that regulatory risk. Can you just again say how the green zone concept does that, so that instead of having to change the national framework? Yeah.
Well, having this zonal approach will help the MPs lobby for a green zone in front of their government, because having this sort of pilot zonal approach, example of a project, will help them issuing voting new regulation without having to go against vested interest that they would have to go against if they would like to change the legislation and the regulation at national level. And once we would have one green zone that is implemented, that is functional, then it will be a good example to be replicated to other regions, and then we move forward. That's really the idea of green zones, is to start taking action. So reducing the perimeter, sorry, but having actually something concrete happening and setting up examples that can then be replicated in the country, but also with giving the example for other countries, because we are organizing these peer-to-peer learning.
So
Dialogues.
we're not going to ministers and saying, you've got to change the law, you've got to change the primary legislation. We're going to ministers and saying, look, why don't you set up a model here? Why don't you set up a small scale, which means you don't have to take on those vested interests you talked about, but actually you can then get something done and show that it works. And again, it's about de-risking the investment money the finance that you hope is coming in. Let's talk maybe about, Sergio, if I can come back to you. Talk about cost of capital and the way in which different countries, often we meet legislators from different countries who simply say, well, if you're right, if all this money's there, why don't you just give it to us and we can get on with it? Or they'll say, well, why are you charging me 18% interest, but you're only charging my neighboring country 12% interest? How are green zones mitigating that risk?
Yes. First of all, I wanted to say that this project, as Leah was mentioning, will involve the dialogue between multiple stakeholders that is going to be convened by the parliamentarians, including a lot of the elements also that Cedric was mentioning. So it's absolutely, it's absolutely crucial to develop renewable energy and then green industry based on that. It's absolutely crucial, as Cedric was saying, to create things, to produce things, basically green industry that can be a source of value add, but also of exports. In this dialogue with the private investors, we've found keen interest in this idea of green zones, keen interest in this possibility of creating a framework that is less ambitious than trying to do it at national level. And that would help us mitigate political risk, payment risk, currency risk. Specifically on currency risk, and part of this would happen through guarantees. And as I was saying, the funds for guarantees are not infinite. They're limited funds for guarantees. So doing it at in a zonal model makes more sense than trying to develop a guarantee, a blanket guarantee for projects in one country. So that's one of the reasons for this. But also when it comes to currency risk, also there's a lot of innovative thinking happening around developing guarantees in local currency. So supporting governments, and then again, the zonal approach would make this easier. And I'm not a finance expert on these matters, but this is one.
I'm sorry, Heather's not with us to speak to this. Yeah.
So this is one area where the thinking is changing into the governments developing guarantees in their own currency, which is something that, and also adding to what Cedric was saying, one can think of these zones as hubs for innovation. Not only financial instrument innovation, but also technological innovation across the global south.
Cedric, just coming back to you here, because the way this has been conceived, the role of the local politician is actually quite important here. If you don't have buy-in from the local deputado or member of parliament or member of Congress. Having that convening power that you have, this isn't going to work terribly well, is it?
I want to deal with the question from two different angles. The one is that strong political leadership, and in South Africa the party system is very strong. And we are fortunate that across the different political parties, they speak with one voice on what needs to be done. So filtering through the system to regional and local politics, they get the message that there is unison in the approach that needs to be taking place. But you need proactive politicians, whether they at local government level, regional or provincial government level, and at national level, to collaborate with one another in the best interest of their entire constituencies, the people. It is important then, not only to consult, but to keep the people involved in the process. So we came up then with an approach to say that apart from setting up the company for the Atlantis Special Economic Zone, we also set up an Atlantis Special Economic Zone board where there is community representation, labor representation, female representation, just to ensure the youth that we have all the basics covered. My apologies. Second one is, what we have seen is, once politicians and public representatives play their role, it sends out a message to prospective investors to say that, hey, these guys are doing something. Let's go and see what are they doing. And maybe your spin-offs will be not only in only a green special economic zone, but even in other projects that's also there to mitigate against climate change and to adapt to climate change. So the politicians, them working together as one collective, sends out a message of confidence to the prospective investor.
Great. Look, I think that's really important, that role of leadership, because any investor is going to say, well, if I'm going to put my money somewhere, I want to put it somewhere where I'm wanted and where I know that somebody's going to help me deliver. So that comes back to you, Leah, because what we need to know is, how is the Climate Parliament, how are you, with your team on the ground, identifying those champions? How do you go about recruiting the people? Is it just any MP who fancies, going to a Climate Parliament conference, or how selective are you in this process?
It's a good question. Well, actually, we are building on some existing network, but how did we select the people in the first place? Well, at the moment, at COP, during COPs, we are engaging, we are networking and trying to find the most climate champion activist members of parliament. We are not, and maybe that is the difference with other parliamentary associations like the IPU, we are not looking at having a universal I'm looking for one word, but whatever. We're not looking to have everybody in the parliament joining the program. We're really looking at climate champion. That's our approach. So we're also talking to the civil society and NGOs on the ground. And our partner is UNIDO, and they've been looking at parliamentarians as well. They have already engaged with some members of parliament. So yes, we are really looking to find some activist parliamentarians. But that's really a sort of case by case, country by country recommendations from here or there from partners, and that's how we go about it.
So when I look to the audience and I see Jakob there from Côte d'Ivoire, and I see our colleagues from Uganda, we're talking about climate champions. We're not just talking about parliamentarians who've got a passing interest in the environment or in energy projects. And I think that is perhaps a unique feature of the Climate Parliament, that it it doesn't try to be a forum for debate. It tries to work with key parliamentarians on delivery at that local level. And what you said about the Green Grids initiative and the success of that very much talks to that element. I want to open it up now to any questions or comments from the audience and see if people want to. Yeah, of course, please.
Trying to track the specifics of how a green zone works. So
Yeah.
so odd to talk into a microphone that actually you can't hear. Can anybody
loud.
hear me? Yes. So I'm trying to track the specifics of how these green zones work. Are they the equivalent for investing as like an EEZ, in a special economic zone? Like what are the dynamics from an investor's perspective that they would, rather than having the confidence that they're just investing into some kind of energy transition or green-based financing opportunity, are they being set up in some way that the investor gets other benefits from that as well? What's the financial, the tax type mechanisms of these green zones? And does it change from country to country, as I imagine it must?
Yes, that's the. I mean, the idea is to have, on one hand, a replicable model, so something that has common features that can be adapted in different countries. But of course, it will be very specific to each country, very specific to the opportunities for each green zone. One key idea is renewable energy resources. That's the basics of everything. But then you have to have in that location also the possibility, the resources for green industry in a competitive way. Then you have to have the connectivity. The engagement with the communities is going to be absolutely fundamental, and that's something that Cedric had touched on in your experience in South Africa, and benefiting the communities as well. Regarding many of them could happen in areas that are where fossil fuels are basically ending their cycle, because you have transmission infrastructure, you have other kind of services infrastructure, and you have a workforce that could participate in a just transition. And then when it comes to de-risking, that is not only financial but also political, as we were discussing. So also exploring synergies across the value chain or along the value chain. So the possibility of perhaps connecting different green zones in different parts of the value chain would be an idea. But I have to repeat where I started. We are beginning to develop this project. We're beginning to engage parliamentarians, and there's work to be done in terms of putting together a green zone toolkit for parliamentarians that is going to include model legislation, modeling tools at an engineering level, examples of best practices, because this is not an entirely novel idea, but it's something that we want to replicate and scale up.
The 15 you mentioned in sub-Saharan Africa, are any of them actually operational as?
This is a project that is just beginning. The project is called Parliamentarians for Climate Finance. It's initially a capacity building project on climate finance for parliamentarians. So green zones will come at a later stage, but in a couple of countries we do have a commitment to prepare a full concept note for funding larger projects that could be green zones, but also the countries are free to determine what they want to do. So we, as I was saying, we provide ideas, but we're not also pushing this very hard. But one thing to keep in mind is that we are exploring expanding this to other African countries, to Latin America, where I'm from, to Asia. So it's an approach that could be potentially larger.
Can I just say that this is something which the Green Climate Fund has funded through its capacity building program, and approached directly to the Climate Parliament, because they knew that they would be able to be the facilitator and provider here. And then that is done through the offices of UNIDO, which is the direct recipient of funds, and then you have the delivery partner, which is the Climate Parliament. Two things I think to draw out from what you said. One, I think, is about the infrastructure connectivity and the importance of that, because the whole idea here is that the infrastructure needs to be built to ensure that if you're producing green electricity, if you've got renewables there, then it's then going out to be used in an industrial context where it is required, and that means that the whole infrastructure connectivity must be there. So it's looking at the green zone as the hub from which, the center of the spider's web from which things are generated. The other is to think in terms of the ability of ODA through blended finance to provide another de-risking element for the private sector capital that is coming in, because ODA can take on that small-scale chunk of finance for a specific green zone, which on a wider level might be more difficult to procure the scale of it. But this is something that is really at that bite-sized level, can really generate a lot more than it would achieve if it were going directly in. By getting that blended finance in, you're de-risking the private sector capital going in there. It's green in any event. You know it's got the political buy-in because the parliaments have come around it. The government is then on board, and the investment is going in very much to a nest that has been created for it. That's the idea.
Barry, and one thing I would add is that we've done a lot of work emphasizing the importance of transmission, the importance of grids, and there's a lot of discussion around the taxonomy specifically for grids, because you always have the risk. I mean, grids are fundamental for a real energy transition, for leaving fossil fuels behind. But it is possible that you will build grids and then you will have dirty electrons being transmitted through the grids. So the idea, the possibility of connecting green zones within countries, if you have more than one, or across borders, would guarantee also that those grids would be green. So that's a very important part of the connectivity part.
Cedric.
Yes, just to respond to the question, very important. What we've realized is that the work that was done in South Africa over the years on our industrial policy, it's very important, because it just opened up the opportunity to say that we're receiving all these commitments and concessional loans and guarantees and a lot of other things. What do you do with it? And then the opportunity arose in that specific area, but you can't just have a green zone there in isolation from everything else. It must be part of your integrated industrial policy plan so that it links up to the other economic opportunities. And in Saldanha, the Saldanha Harbour, for instance, is near the Atlantis Special Economic Zone. The government then decided to appoint a private operator to make the harbour more efficient so that any product that is produced there can be exported, not a lot of fuss, to the nearest harbour and can be exported elsewhere. But with that development that is taking place there, other green shoots are now appearing along the west coast. And the one is green hydrogen that we're working with the government of Japan and JICA, and then further north, a massive battery center, solar battery center, working with private sector from the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom government. But it opened up other possibilities. So once you start off and the investors are convinced they're making an investment, the local conditions must be conducive for them. There must be incentives, and that can be done by politicians. And ultimately, once you have that in place, and it takes time, you have to work very hard to cut the time. By the way, it won't just happen on its own. It's not the silver bullet to say we're planting a green a special economic zone there. It requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of forward thinking and vision from the political leadership.
Great. Any further questions comments? Yep. Yeah, sure.
Sorry to hog it. I should just sit there and have a private audience with you. What other activities are you envisaging in these green zones other than renewables? That's the obvious one. But you mentioned earlier, you said that you're looking at innovation and using these green zones as a form of innovation or to catalyst innovation. What would that look like? What else?
Depending on the resources, the key is renewable energy and then green industry. And that could be hydrogen, cement, ammonia for fertilizer, steel. And that's what I was saying, that you could even think of data centers in certain countries where where you have in an area where there's excellent resources for renewable energy, you can have that. And then creating value basically across the global south, and also an opportunity for exports, which is essential. And some of the investors that we have been talking to are very interested in this approach, and particularly in the idea of developing exports from industry based on this zonal approach. But it will depend on a lot of factors, including political buy-in in the countries at the national level, but also at the regional level in many cases, buying from the communities. We were discussing, there are areas, for instance, in Latin America, on the Colombian coast, that have excellent wind resources, but the history of the engagement with the local communities and the indigenous communities has not been done in the right way, and it would be quite hard to mobilize, to have the community support that you really need to develop the green zone. So you're actually building a puzzle of a lot of many factors, including competitive advantage. You have to be able to do it in a way that will attract, because it will be done by private investment. It will be done by private capital. We're talking about de-risking to mobilize that private investment.
Thanks very much. My name is Lucas Somavilla. I'm from UCL, University College London. Very interesting, the whole idea of green investment zones. I just have a question. When you talked about the added value of these investments, and you mentioned that there will be a heavily focus on exports, so energy for exports, materials for exports. But in a sense, we also need to think about inwards into how can we improve the industrial base of the country, how can we improve the added value into the national economy so that some of that value actually stays there. And we build, particularly for African countries that lack the infrastructure and they are at the bottom of the value chain. Is there something that, will also be discussed? Thank you.
Absolutely. When we say exports, it doesn't mean export of raw materials. We're not talking about raw materials. One of the countries, I don't want to get into the details because this is their sovereign decision, but one of the countries where we're going to be working is Guinea, which is very rich in iron ore, just as an example. And this collaboration or creating zones might mean iron smelting or even green steel rather than just exporting the ore. Creating value in these countries is very important, and it's not just exports of raw materials, for sure.
If you're producing the energy there and you're using that to make the steel, to make the glass, to make the cement, to make the ceramics, because that's the green hydrogen that you produce needs to be used there to actually add exactly the value that you're talking about to that country's own growth potential. Yeah. Yes, Melanie, our host.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm delighted that the pavilion is so full and the discussion is so stimulating. So really welcome to colleagues from the Climate Parliament. And for those who you don't know, Climate Parliament is one of the members of the parliamentary group. So delighted to have this opportunity to engage with you on this specific issue because, of course, Barry, you would have mentioned that there was the conference in Istanbul just before COP. And I wanted to bring attention to what the COP presidency is doing on this agenda, because there's a real opportunity for synergy. So the presidency has identified 14 action partnerships. It calls it the action agenda, the presidency's action agenda. And 2 of those are extremely relevant. One of them, of course, is on green energy zones and corridors. And there's another one which is, of course, on grids. And there's another one which is on hydrogen. And this shows that actually the approach of the host is very different. The approach of the host is similar to what you were talking about, setting an industrial policy which is guided by net zero commitments. And so it's not just one thing here, another thing here, but it's looking at the overall strategic direction that the country is taking. And yesterday we had a really good session which was looking at net zero in industrial policies. How is the net zero commitment shaping the industrial policy of Japan, of New Zealand, etc.? So I think here that the synergy is very evident. It is for this initiative and others taken up because, of course, this is a parliamentary discussion. And this, by the way, it's Mike Weeks. Mike is from Sage Intel, and they're going to be hosting the next session, so please do stay for that. And also, not unincidentally, the sponsor, one of the sponsors of the principal sponsor of the pavilion. So I would urge us to take this back to the presidency. We, of course, have a very good relationship with them because we have been working with them on one of their initiatives, which is the Multi-Level Action Partnership, the MAPS initiative, which is the only one of the 14 which mentions parliamentary engagement. So one other thing, you're sitting behind the map. So that is the map of Baku. And if you'll know about the port of Baku. Now, the port of Baku is actually shifted over here. And it's now in a new green industrial zone. So this is the logic of the reshaping of this country's economy is guided by the green transition. And all of these elements of the 14 are part of that. So it's not reported on. It's because the press chooses other things. But this is part of a very intelligent approach to completely restructuring an economy and identifying what are the elements and who are the key stakeholders in that. So I just wanted to add that as a key point of information because taking this forward, we would like to integrate it as an outcome for COP29.
Great, Melanie, thank you so much. And absolutely right. This is something which is entirely consistent with the whole direction that the world is going. And that's why we need the parliamentary champions. We need to make sure that this is integrated into government thinking and that they then say, yeah, okay, we can pilot this, we can see if it works, and then we can roll it out. And that strategic overview that the presidency is putting in place is really important. I want to give the last word to Leah because there will be people, I hope, watching on your broadcast, Melanie, who will be parliamentarians who are saying, oh, how could my country get involved in this?
Yes, sure. So if you want to get in touch, whoever's watching us, you can just go on Climate Parliament website. There will be a contact form that you can fill and one of the members will pick up the message. And for the people who are in the room, please just stay around and we can chat further about the project. It is not yet on the website, but it is something that we could share. So, Melanie, you were mentioning the UNFCCC agenda, the presidential agenda, the presidential pledge on Green Zone number 4 on green energy and zones that also mentioned corridors. We have drafted a matching pledge for members of parliament to come and support the presidential pledge, which was signed by about 40 members of parliament during our green investment dialogue in Istanbul. Now it will be posted on our website, so if ever any parliamentarians are watching us and would like to read the pledge and become a signatory, again, just email us from the website and we'll be happy to add your names.
To mention an opportunity, if you're going to be here on the 19th, that's next week, the 19th, the day before the Urban Day, we will have Elmar Mammadov. He's from the presidency. He's responsible for all of the partnerships here for an exchange on parliamentary engagement in the partnerships. So please do come.
Good to know that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody in the room, and thank you everybody for watching. The session's now over.